Hello everybody! Before we begin, I would like to let you all know that I have a book out. It is called Not Quite Dead, and it is the story of a woman whose fiancé passed away a year ago, having dreams where he tells her that he's still alive and trying to use said dreams to get him back. It is available on Amazon in both paperback and ebook formats, so if you've ever wanted to support me financially, then this is your opportunity to do so. Link is in the description. Hey gang, it's Squill, and we're finally at Season 5, the final mainline season of Steven Universe. It's by far the most controversial season of the show, between the rose quartz reveal, what the show does with the diamonds, and the Garnet wedding. However, it is also a season with a lot to talk about, so I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being the longest Steven Universe retrospective so far. As I mentioned last retrospective, seasons 4 and 5 of Steven Universe are actually just one big production season split in half, with season 5 being the second half. However, because Steven Universe was cancelled this season, 8 additional episodes were ordered to wrap up the series' story. And the reason why the show was cancelled is because of the wedding between Ruby and Sapphire. Steven Universe was already being targeted in other countries due to its queer themes and characters. In fact, in Russia, Ruby was hilariously changed to be male so that they could avoid depicting two women in a romantic relationship. So let's just say depicting the first ever gay marriage in a kids' cartoon was a step too far for some countries, leading to Cartoon Network canceling the show as a result. Ironic, given that nowadays Cartoon Network parades Ruby and Sapphire alongside Marceline and Princess Bubblegum, as if the network was just oh so progressive this entire time, and not the ones who cancelled Steven Universe to begin with. And the reason why I bring all this up is because queer media, especially queer stuff aimed at kids, is still being censored to this day. It is a very scary time to be queer right now, as gay and especially trans people are being attacked now more than they have in quite a while. So be sure to support and champion queer creators, not just mainstream stuff like Adventure Time and Steven Universe, but smaller, independent queer artists. But going back to Season 5, this season is structured a little differently from the seasons prior. Whereas previous seasons would have a group of one-off standalone episodes in between the bigger multi-episode story arcs, Season 5 is kinda just a bunch of multi-episode story arcs back to back to back. Of course, a couple of these arcs have one or two episodes within them that don't really relate to what's going on within the storyline. But for the most part, Season 5 really doesn't slow down much at all. Though you could definitely make the argument that its pacing is a little too fast in some places. We'll discuss these individual arcs a bit more after talking about the major themes and characters of the season. I think the biggest theme in Season 5 of Steven Universe is that of change. A lot of characters get major status quo shifts this season. Lars becomes an immortal space captain, Sadie and the Cool Kids start a band, Nanafua takes over from Dewey as mayor, Lapis leaves Earth, Peridot moves into the temple, Bismuth rejoins the Crystal Gems, Ruby and Sapphire get married, the Diamonds, well, change their minds, Marge becomes a robot, and Pearl gets a cell phone. Hell, Letters to Lars is an episode entirely about the changes happening in Beach City. This season really emphasizes the importance of both physical and emotional change and growth. And nowhere is this more apparent than with Rose Quartz. While Season 5 was airing, Rebecca Sugar described the season as a murder mystery. Who was the one responsible for the shattering of Pink Diamond? We'll talk about the actual reveal that Rose Quartz is Pink Diamond, and the arc surrounding that in a bit, but really the mystery behind Pink's shattering is prevalent throughout the entire season. The Trial is an episode all about whether or not Rose Quartz shattered Pink Diamond. In Jungle Moon, Stevonnie has a strange dream putting them into perspective of Pink Diamond. In Your Mother and Mine, we hear Garnet's flawed interpretation of Rose's backstory. And in Can't Go Back, Steven has another dream indicating that Pearl was somehow involved in Pink's shattering. It's a mystery that's very well built up and paid off, one of the strongest aspects of the season overall. But with that, let's pivot to how Season 5 handles its characters. This season takes a pretty hard focus on Steven's identity. It's obviously been a thing for most of the series by now, but there are a lot more instances of characters mistaking Steven for Rose Quartz or Pink Diamond this season. And this is obviously the most prominent with the diamond. This little identity crisis for Steven can definitely be read through a trans lens. After all, the diamond, Steven's family, still view Steven as Pink, despite his insistence that he is a separate person. The climax of the original series is Steven being reaffirmed of his own identity. It's a fitting arc for Steven for the final season of the original show. It feels very climatic, like this is what the series was building to. As far as Garnet, Amethyst, and Pearl go, this is probably their best season since Season 2. I think all three of them got a good amount of focus here, mostly in the latter half of the season. Pearl gets a big focus episode in the form of a single pale rose, and plays a fairly big role throughout the last two arcs of the season, given her connection to Rose, the Diamonds, and Homeworld. Amethyst gets another episode with Peridot in the form of Back to the Kindergarten, and an episode focused on her reaction to the Pink Diamond reveal in What's Your Problem. Garnet gets a big spotlight episode in the form of Pool Hopping, and gets an episode with the off-colors in Your Mother and Mine. We also get a lot of Ruby and Sapphire this season, with the two splitting up and then choosing to get married after the Rose Quartz reveal. Considering that this is the final mainline season of Steven Universe, I'm definitely glad that all of our main characters get a significant amount to do. The same, unfortunately, cannot be said for Peridot and Lapis. As mentioned earlier, Lapis leaves Earth this season after hearing about Steven's confrontation with the Diamonds. It's an interesting idea and makes sense for her character, but she ends up becoming a pretty big victim of the Steven perspective rule. As outside of her one spotlight in Can't Go Back, Lapis doesn't really do much this season. She's just kind of gone for a good chunk of episodes, only to arbitrarily return when the plot needs her to and reunited. Peridot fares a little bit better, getting two major spotlight episodes back-to-back in the form of Raising the Barn and Back to the Kindergarten. But she doesn't really get to do much after these episodes. I do like, at least on paper, that she moves back into the temple, as it gives her a chance to interact with the other gems, which she hasn't really done much of since the Barn arc. But aside from her episode with Amethyst, the show doesn't really capitalize on this much. So yeah, pretty weak year for these two as a whole. This is a pretty weak batch for Greg too, he doesn't really get to do much this season. The biggest role he got this year was probably Gemcation, but even in that one, he gets about as much screen time as Garnet, Amethyst, and Pearl. I have a couple more characters I want to talk about, but to do so, we're going to have to get into the arcs of Season 5, of which there are quite a few this year. Starting off, we have the Wanted arc. This is a 4-episode arc involving Steven and Lars being stranded on Homeworld. I love this arc. It is one of my all-time favorites in the entire show. If it were just a little bit longer, it'd be right up there with the Barn arc in Season 2 for me. It is within this arc that we get our very first look at Homeworld. They really nail its oppressive atmosphere. The stakes feel high as Steven and Lars are on the run from the Diamond authorities. And along with that, we meet the off-colors here, a group of gems the Diamonds have deemed defective and thus have been cast aside. They're fun characters and make for good commentary about how the world discards disabled people, but they're not really given the time to be fleshed out very much. But this is hopefully something the show will be able to remedy in the Lars of the Stars spinoff. Pat Paracha is probably my favorite of the bunch. She's adorable and really funny. But what really makes this arc for me is Lars. Now, I have a bit of a hot take, and that is that I've always really liked Lars, even before he was involved in gem stuff. I think he made for a really fun character foil to Steven, the Squidward to his SpongeBob, if you will. And I've always enjoyed his teenage struggle of being sincere versus fitting in. But even as someone who was already a fan of the character, this arc just does wonders for him. Gets some really great development in these 4 episodes, in both his sense of self-worth and his friendship with Steven. He learns to embrace the parts of himself that he spent the entire rest of the series rejecting, and he uses this newfound sense of self to stand up for others. And through this, he's able to gain a new community of people who genuinely like him. By the end of these 4 episodes, Lars truly does feel like a changed person. Not just because he's pink now and involved in the gem stuff, but because he became the person he really always was deep down. The person he was afraid of. He still has growing to do, as I'm sure we'll see in his spin-off, but the hard part of learning to like himself is more or less over. Overall, the Wanted arc is fantastic, and probably the high point of the season for me. No spoilers, but don't be surprised if all 4 of its episodes make my top 10 list. Unfortunately, said high point is immediately followed by the season's low point, with the Steven and Connie arc. Now, I don't dislike this arc on paper. I actually do think that Connie is justified in being mad at Steven. He gave himself up with very little in the way of an actual plan, leaving everyone else mortified as to what might happen to him. At the same time, Steven was put in a very tight spot where he had to do something to protect the people of Beach City. It's an interesting moral dilemma that could have made for a very nuanced conflict if handled well. It was not handled well. Much like with Lapis, Connie's side of this arc is another one that suffers really bad from the Steven POV rule. Because she's absent and Steven doesn't know where she is, from Dewey wins to Kevin party, her side of the story just feels very shallow. Like, the show doesn't really get the chance to explore Connie's feelings here. Because most of her development happens off-screen, there's not much in the way of an actual arc for her. What it more or less amounts to is that Steven and Connie aren't friends for a few episodes, then they have one conversation where they make up, and all of a sudden they're besties again. And on Steven's end, it's basically just 5 episodes of him being kinda mopey. It's not particularly fun to watch, or very interesting. Overall, this arc just doesn't feel like it matters very much. It doesn't really affect Steven and Connie's friendship in a major way, and what nuance it could have had is ultimately stripped away when all it takes is a single conversation for it to be resolved. What follows this arc is a handful of episodes, most of which involving Lars and the Off-Colors on their space adventure. I like these episodes. It's nice to catch up with Lars and see how he's further grown into the space pirate role. But it might be a little bit of a stretch to call it a full arc. It just doesn't really feel complete. It feels like a lot of it takes place off-screen. Which I guess doesn't really matter anymore, now that Lars and the Off-Colors are getting a full series about them. But a part of me still wishes they got a little bit more here. Following this, we have the Rose Quartz reveal / Garnet Wedding arc. A set of episodes depicting the fallout of the Rose Quartz's Pink Diamond reveal. To touch on the twist itself first, because it's a fairly controversial one, I've never really had a problem with Rose Quartz being Pink Diamond. Granted, I'm a little biased, as I knew about the twist before watching through all of Steven Universe, but I think it works really well with the show thematically. Steven Universe is a show all about not conforming to the roles society puts on you, about living your life freely without feeling the need to repress who you are. And Rose Quartz is the perfect embodiment of this. Someone who was born into power and could have easily used said power to oppress people, but instead chose to use it to protect people. This isn't to say that Rose was perfect, of course. It is absolutely unfair how she made it up to Steven to pick up her mess. She left Pearl with a ton of unresolved trauma. And of course there's Spinel, who we'll talk about when it's time to discuss the Steven Universe movie. But I think that's also part of the point. Rose wasn't some flawless hero, nor was she some maniacal villain. She was just a person. A person who could definitely grow and change, but someone who is still capable of hurting the people around her. What I also like about this arc is that we get an entire episode dedicated to how each of the crystal gems react to this reveal. We get Now We're Only Falling Apart for Sapphire, What's Your Problem for Amethyst, and the question for Ruby. Even in an arc surrounding this crazy twist, Steven Universe remains a very character-driven show. And of course, I already talked about it near the start of the video, but words cannot emphasize enough just how important this Ruby and Sapphire wedding is. It's a groundbreaking moment, not just in the history of the show, or even the history of animation, but just in LGBT history. It really is a shame that the show had to be cancelled in order for a moment like this to happen, but I think it was worth it. And I hold a ton of respect for Rebecca Sugar for not backing down on this. But with Steven Universe getting cancelled, that left the crew with only 8 episodes to resolve its final arc, the Diamonds arc. Now, I do actually enjoy this final arc quite a bit. As I discussed earlier, I do really love Steven's inner conflict here, his identity crisis over whether or not he and Rose are the same person. And of course, it's always fun getting to explore more of Homeworld. But it is undeniable that this arc feels a little rushed. Mostly in terms of how it handles the diamonds. As it feels like all it really takes for Steven to win over the diamonds is to have one conversation with them. Especially White, who doesn't even get her first on-screen appearance until this arc. I do mostly blame the show's cancellation as to why this arc isn't as fleshed out as it should be. But at the same time, did we really need a Watermelon Steven episode right before the finale? But I will play devil's advocate in the sense that I don't think Steven should have shattered the diamonds. Another major theme in Steven Universe is open communication, that a lot of problems can be solved simply by talking things out. Having Steven shatter White Diamond would just go completely against what the show was trying to say thematically. Not to mention, how irresponsible would it be for the show to tell kids that killing people is the easy solution to your problems? But at the same time, the way Steven wins over the diamonds also feels a little too easy. It should take at least a little more convincing for these dictators to join Steven's side. The movie and future definitely help remedy this issue a little bit, by showing that the diamonds are still in the process of unlearning their bigotry. But yeah, the way it's presented here definitely could have been better. And that's Steven Universe Season 5. It's definitely not a perfect final-ish season with a fair amount of pacing issues. But it also has a lot of high points, and I think it's a stronger batch overall than Season 4. Even if some stuff feels a little rushed, it at least always feels like the show is moving this season. The season being divided into different arcs definitely helps keep things interesting. Say what you will about Season 5, but it's rarely ever boring. Let me know your guys' thoughts on Season 5 in the comments, and I'll see you all for the top 10 list. Have a good one, and Squill out.